Greetings. I think we have several people in the Zoom environment, but thanks for those of you who came across campus. It's nice to have some folks in the room, obviously, but rather than all on Zoom. So basically, I'm thrilled today to say that we have sort of a first. I mean, we've had some speakers before on DEIA in the last year, but in terms of really, potentially formalizing a speaker series, we're kind of having an inaugural event. And we're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Tony Puente here to talk about kind of his experiences as well as the field around DEIA issues. And, in particular, why I say I'm so thrilled that he's able to be here is that he is a psychology department alum, and I believe he is the only psychology program alum who became president of APA. So I think that's a pretty prestigious trajectory for one of our alums. And so it's great to have him back. The other thing is that he's part of an initiative that we've been working with the college on to build an advisory board to help us with alumni relations and to help us sort of think about things that we're trying to build and develop in the department. And he has graciously agreed over these maybe 2 years at this point to chair that advisory board. And really, again, given his wealth of leadership knowledge, organizational leadership knowledge, it's really been invaluable for us to be able to draw on that and have such a, accomplished alum who's able to provide some advice for us and to help us launch some initiatives here at the University of Florida and to work better with our alumni base. We have a huge and wonderful alumni base, but what we want is for them to feel engaged in the kinds of things that are important to us, like the diversity, equity, and inclusion and access missions that we have in the department. So to give you, I believe Tony's actually going to be telling you a bit about himself. So I don't want to sort of spare the highlights. But he is a professor of psychology at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He was the 2017 president of the American Psychological Association, which, as you may know, also includes a year as president-elect and a year as past president. And again, for those of you in psychology, obviously, this is a key organization for one, we have an APA accredited program in our department. So we're certainly closely aligned with some of the initiatives at APA. Dr. Puente was born in La Habana, Cuba, emigrated to the US in 1960 and received his PhD from the University of Georgia. We won't talk about that much, but the BA from the University of Florida. He's been at Wilmington since 1981, and he has really been, his primary areas have been in clinical neuropsychology. He's been a visiting professor in Spain, at UCLA, at a number of different places, and he's the founding director of UNCW's Centro Hispano, and his research focuses on the interface between culture and neuropsychology. So he's well accomplished, many publications, chapters, books, peer-reviewed articles, many invited talks. So we're extremely fortunate that because we're having an advisory board meeting, he was gracious to come in a bit early and share some of his thoughts with us today. So I will turn it over and let you clip on, actually.
Appreciate that introduction, and good to have a few of you here and a few online. It's always a pleasure to be back in Gainesville. And this is an unusual presentation for me for a lot of reasons. And one of them is this kind of thing that, as I say in the green portion of my title, it's a lecture that you really can only give when you have tenure, green card, and you've been in a position of some significance within your field. It's going to be a bit personal and a bit theoretical and a bit prescriptive as well. So it's going to be a combination of all that. And I hope towards the end we have an opportunity to chat openly about these kinds of things. So Julia, are you handling the presentation or should I? No, that's fine. Okay. All right. As always, one can only do these things if there's a group of people that are there to support you. And I know some of them are actually online at the present time. And so thank you for all those folks that make this happen. They're both at the graduate level, postdoctoral level, as well as undergraduates. Most of the people are not from the U.S. and some are local. We always say that we need token locals as well as ethnic minorities and individuals from other countries. So to all those, thank you for making it happen. All right, so this is the outline. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about some formative years. How is it that I came to be where I am? Julia was really kind enough to give the formal background in terms of the so-called accolades, accomplishments, but I think you should hear some of the things that are really behind the scenes, sort of the rest of the story, not what's on the vita, but maybe why is it that it is who I am and how did I come to be? I'm probably going to do something that I haven't done before, and that is I want to talk to you about some challenging experiences that really define, again, who I am. So not only some things that may be who I am as a person on a positive note, that's sort of the formative years, and some things that are really less desirable. And then subsequently, I'm going to sort of shift away from me. This is only to give you a rough background of who I am. And maybe that will help you understand the things that I'm going to talk about, because the bulk of the lecture starts with psychology's founding fathers. And the reason for that is my fun activity in psychology and outside of neuropsychology is that I collect old books in psychology, always wishing that eventually I would write a book about the history of psychology using the primary references. And oddly enough, I got that interest here at University of Florida with one of my professors, Don Dewsbury, who became really the big historian of psychology during his tenure in here at U of F. And then I'm going to sort of shift a little bit, talk about what I call the Browning of psychology. And when I was actually giving a sort of form to my presentation, I was actually thinking about adding the title "and the whitening of psychology," which are two different things. But I'll explain to you what is it that I consider to be psychology's problem. And then if there was a particular time in the presentation that you should really focus, all the other stuff is good and informative, it's going to be the next part. And that's going to be neuropsychology and power. And I'm going to explain to you in a lot of detail as we go through it. And I want you to know, by the way, that that's not an error in typing. Neuropsychology. I think it could be considered a single word or a singular concept, and I'll explain that. But more for those of you who think about neuropsychology as a construct, I think it's somewhat less important than the concept of power. And then I'm going to propose to you the idea of maybe where we might be wanting to go. And that's going to be based on some of my own experiences, both positively and negatively. So I'm going to kind of bring it back. I'm going to bring it back to who I am and how that has informed me in terms of what psychology might look like. And then I'm going to propose a hybrid model that really is very much a model based on international thinking and, if you will, thinking that I obtained from the US. And that's, well, we'll sort of bring it back to the very beginning. All right, so are you ready? You ready, Ron? Yeah, Ron, I see Ron there just looking very serious. All right, so let's see, somehow, yeah, okay, the formative years. So who is Tony Puente, Antonio Puente? Well, first of all, this is where I spent my time growing up. Yeah, you're going, yeah, let's go there. Yeah, I like that. This is actually a beautiful beach called Tarara. And I would spend my weeks in the city and my weekends in the beach, which is not too far away, maybe about 45 minutes away. Let me share something about this place. This is actually the beach where all the kids from Chernobyl were taken away from that, you know, the bizarre thing that occurred many years ago to heal. And the person who led the charge for trying to make that occur psychologically was Alexis Ruiz, who happened to be president of the Society of Cuban Psychology, which this is right by his home. And this is about 2 blocks where I spent my, again, formative years. I bonded with Alexis, and since then, he's told me lots of stories about the role of health psychology in healing Chernobyl, and also about how psychology works in a communist country, which you can only hear from me after you've given me some rum and cokes, which I'm not going to reveal. All right, so as you see, there's 2 pictures of competing schools, one with a football team and the other one looking for a football team. And that's a Rorschach card. Which one is which? Okay, well, we won't get into it, but that's University of Florida. But I think you should hear about how I got here. I was broke when I graduated from high school. I went to Catholic school. After all, I'm Cuban. You didn't have an option. And seriously limited in terms of funds. So my dad didn't assume that I would go to college. I would just get a job. But I had heard there was a new community college that had started in Jacksonville, Florida, called Florida Junior College. It was actually an abandoned ghetto elementary school. Seemed like a perfect fit. I had no idea where I was going, and it was cheap. It was $100 a semester. So I could work at a local 5 and dime store, live with my mom and dad, and go to this new experience called college. I happened to end up in a psychology class because the guy across the street said, "This is cool stuff." And you know, whatever. So there I was. I did very well. I enjoyed it, and I got all kinds of nice scholarships, including to Florida State University. I got the presidential scholarship, which took care of my tuition. But for some reason, it's not clear in my mind. At the very last moment, before I was headed to Tallahassee, I told my mom, I think the University of Florida has a good psychology department, having no evidence that that was true. Now, I know now that your online program is number 2 in the nation, according to US News and World Report, but I had no data. It's just like an intuition. So I showed up at Tigard Hall. In those days, they were having a lot of demonstrations, including a couple of months before. The students had taken over Tigard Hall and requested all kinds of things. And it just seemed like the right place to go to get admitted. So I showed up with my transcript, a little bit of cash, and I gave the lady my transcript. She said, "Fill out this application. It's $25 and you're in." That's it? Yep. Okay, go down the hall because there are only a few classes open. And one of the classes that was open was Don Dewsbury's animal behavior class at 8 a.m. And he said to me, "I'm looking for somebody to work in the lab." He didn't give me the job because I had no qualifications, but he did give me an opportunity to do research. We've written several chapters together, some in his books, him in my books, and still today, I still keep up with him. So that random experience of just serendipity, just showing up and just saying, "This is where I need to go." It began a long-winded relationship with my undergraduate advisor, and again, a great historian of psychology. I applied to many schools in the state of Florida because my father said, if you go outside of the state of Florida, we will disown you. After all, his Hispanic father. He had told me, talk about having no data. Only people who are homosexuals, communists, and Jews go into psychology. It's like, where did that come from? And me, more importantly, what does that mean? Just don't go to school outside. I did apply to one school outside of Florida, and it was a new program called neuroscience or biopsychology. And it's like, whoa, this sounds like this is what I'm interested in. So off from Florida to Georgia, I went. And subsequent to that, after finishing up my PhD, I spent some time in the laboratory of Roger Sperry, random as much as it was for me to end up at the University of Florida. At the time, I had started a book series in neuropsychology, which neuropsychology didn't exist. I just got my PhD and I needed some information. I said, let's start a book series. To make a long story short, I went and sought him out, and he basically said, why don't you spend time with me and I will give you all the knowledge that I have, and maybe we can get a book out of it. We never got a book, but I will tell you that I spent as much time as I could for a bunch of years, first at the faculty club at Caltech, and subsequently in his garage apartment, spending time just listening, working in the lab, testing the split brain patients. And when he passed, just again, serendipity, I was chair of the American Psychological Association's convention and decided that we would have a festivity in his honor. He passed away, but 64, almost 90% of his students that were alive came together at that conference. And from that began a new kind of career. And that is, I became the historian and archivist of Roger Sperry. Really happy to say that after about 30 years, we finally finishing archiving all his materials, and you can find it at rogersperry.org. So a point of fact that's really interesting. You know, he won the Nobel Prize in 1981 for his work on split brain. He cut 45 people, studied 15, but published only on 5. And most of the studies are with one person. One person. He won a Nobel Prize by extensively studying LB. So sometimes you wonder, how is science supposed to be? Hey, by the way, I was sharing this with a couple of folks earlier on. This is something that you should remember, because I remember on a regular basis when I went through my rough periods, which I'll share with you in a moment. Between 1950 and 1952, his wife left him for a urologist, of all things, which she said, please don't put in my bio. He's dead. 2, he didn't get tenure at the University of Chicago, which produces the largest number of Nobel Prize winners in the world of any institution. And number 3, he lost his health by doing research with ungloved hands up the road in Orange Park in monkeys. He got tuberculosis and ended up having to go to Catskills Mountain. 30 years later, he wins a Nobel Prize. Just remember, if you remember nothing else from our discussion today, 30 years after you lose everything, you find yourself in that situation. As a purveyor of old books, I was really interested in Russian neuropsychology because that's really where it started. It started in Moscow. So I would exchange letters, and right after the Soviet Union fell, I wondered, could I show up? So they invited me to, first of all, to Pavlov's lab, and subsequently to Alexander Luria's lab in Moscow, Pavlov and St. Petersburg, and Luria in Moscow, or as the people from St. Petersburg called Moscow, the Little Village. So off to the Little Village I went. It was a successful visit, returned several times, and some of Luria's students came to work with me, and subsequently, some of Luria's intellectual grandchildren as well. So I remained very much in contact, and one of the last things that I was able to do before the the beginning of COVID and spent some time in Loria's laboratory and subsequently named honorary professor of psychology. Good things. Let's hear some bad ones. You ready for the bad ones? University of Georgia. After my first year in graduate school, I had some difficulties. My professor, Louis Proenza, started dating my girlfriend. But she goes, Antonio, what do you think about me dating Louis? I said, look, I live in the dorms. I have a bicycle and I'm broke. Louis is like older. He has a car. He has a house. He has a salary. I think he's a better fit. She was like 28 and I was 21. I was like, yeah. She calls me up about 2 months later. She goes, I got to have coffee with you. Yeah. I told Louis he was not half the gentleman you were. Oh, Paloma, it's really bad. You left me for Louis. It's even worse. You left Louis for me. So at the end of that first year in grad school, I got a vote of no confidence. And here's what they said. I remember the guy who told me was Brad Bunnell. He told me in the college research station where they used to do brain surgery on monkeys. And it was Friday night around 7 o'clock at dusk. And he was kicking the little stones in the parking lot. And he just said, you're a really nice guy, but we don't think you know enough English to be able to publish. We think you should think of some other career like sales or maybe something like that. So we won't kick you out, but we're not encouraging you to return. I was thinking to my dad, yeah, you were right. I'm not any of those people. Maybe I should turn Jewish at this particular point because somehow or the other, these guys were not getting me. And my dad was clearly not supporting me. So I went back home, worked in a psychiatric hospital from 11 to 7, 11 at night, 7 in the morning, trying to figure out what to do. And I said, screw this shit. These people have no idea who I am. I got my master's on January 13th, 1978. And Julia's, don't listen to this one, Julia. And I defended my dissertation on January 13th, 1978. My master's on one Friday, my PhD in neuroscience the following Friday, clinical neuroscience. So I was trying to do both. They didn't understand my Spanish. They clearly didn't understand my idea of bridging the idea of clinical and neuro together. So when a few years later, they called me to do the commencement speech in the psych department, I said, no, do you guys remember you were trying to get rid of me? And they go, yeah, that was then, this is now. I finally got a job at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I was fortunate because in those days, they weren't hiring a lot of people in clinical neuropsychology. And for those of you that wonder, yes, I was interested in life-work balance. My primary hobby is surfing. And the school is about 3 miles from the ocean. I surfed yesterday, and as I was telling a couple of folks a minute ago, today the waves were epic, and here I am talking to you about why I moved to Wilmington. But when I went up for tenure, I went up early. I'd gotten Fulbright, I had gotten a few things, publications. They said, we don't really kind of appreciate the research that you're doing. It's not really in the scheme of what psychology is like. So we're not going to give you tenure. But you have the opportunity if you want to next year, but we don't think that's going to happen. Well, it did happen. Not only did it happen, but I'm the most senior member of the department, which now has 36. We have a PhD program, APA accredited, and all those people didn't vote for me. Well, they're no longer with us. My cousins from Miami came up and took care of it. Hey, wait a minute, that was not a joke. All right. So soon after I got tenure, I said, okay, it's time to get board certified. There was a new board certification process in clinical neuropsychology, and it's called American Board of Clinical Neuropsychology. I decided to apply, and I submitted a case study involving Loria's approach to understanding brain dysfunction in a Spanish-speaking person. It was for those of you who know something about clinical neuropsychology, it's what they call it was a fixed battery approach that I translated and so forth, so on. Anyway, Harold Goodglass was my examiner. Harold Goodglass actually was a student of Norm Geschwin, who was a competitor to Roger Sperry and the developer of the flexible approach to neuropsychology. Since, in case you haven't figured it out, I am a stable genius, I went in there totally like ready to jump off a cliff. I presented an idea to a person that didn't believe in it, and he knew that I studied with his professor's nemesis. I got chopped. I am the first person to have flunked this exam process. Now, here's the part that's really interesting too. First of all, later on, about 2-3 years later, I was invited together with Professor Goodglass and Harold Prebrem to attend the first Luria conference in Moscow. And on October 31st, it started snowing. And in Russia, they don't turn on the heat until October 1st. It was extremely cold in the dorms. And he came and knocked on my door like at midnight. Dr. Puente, I'm freezing. I know you know some Russian. Could you find me a blanket? And I thought to myself, it's time for you to die, old man. And then all of a sudden, I saw my wife over here, and I saw my mom saying, how could you have those thoughts? He's an old man, he's in trouble. Went to find him a damn blanket. He went on to live. About 25 years later, they started board certifying ethnic minorities. It took them over 2 decades for this board certification process to certify an ethnic minority. And a few years after that, I started getting all kinds of like, hooray mail, congratulations, you finally did it, because Antonio Puente actually passed. The bad news is it was Antonio Nicholas Puente, my son, and not Antonio Enrique Puente. He's a better looking, more intelligent, and better prepared. So at least one Antonio Puente is certified by this board. It ain't me. All right. So, you know, I got lucky. I got to work with a Nobel Prize winner. I got to work with not him because he had passed away, the founder of neuropsychology. I went to the original source, just wonderful experiences. I came to school here, lucky me that I didn't go to somewhere like FSU, but I also had some really serious challenges. I mean, could you imagine not getting tenure? Could you imagine flunking your board? Could you imagine being told the first year of graduate school you don't know enough English to be able to publish? These are challenges. I wonder what was in me that made me think that they were wrong. Now, going back to the source is an important point. Keep these things in mind as I go into the next part. Having collected books and having gone to these places just to see it for myself, I want to tell you about the books of the 3 founders of psychology in their respective parts of the world. William James, in the basement of Emerson Hall, put together a laboratory in 1874. And if you read his book, The Principle of Psychology, Volume 1, Volume 2, or the briefer version, it's really nothing more than a neuropsychology textbook. And in fact, Sperry was exposed to that when he was 15 and subsequently was taught by one of James's students at Oberlin College. So if you go down in deep analysis, really the original textbook in psychology in the US is nothing more than a neuropsychology book. As a matter of fact, in the first chapter, James talks about the function and structure of the cerebral hemispheres, which is what Sperry dedicated his life to. Let's go to Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, which basically put the real first laboratory in 1879. If you look at his textbook, it's also nothing more than basic principles of how the brain works. And if you go to Ivan Pavlov's, same thing. As a matter of fact, when I visited Pavlov's laboratory, I told him that Pavlov was one of the best known learning theorists in the United States. And they said, well, why is that? So because we all know about classical conditioning. Of course, you've been taught in all these courses. They said, well, we don't use that phrase here. As a matter of fact, we don't use, Pavlov did not allow the word learning. It was habituation. So to him, the concept of classical conditioning turns out to be amorphous. And again, if you look at his book, only tiny sections of the book are associated with classical conditioning. And the subtitle is 25 Years of Objective Study in Higher Nervous Behavior of Animals. The people in his laboratory are not learning theorists, they're neuropsychologists. So here's the question that comes to mind. What happened? Well, a young whippersnapper named John B. Watson, who came from a tiny school in Greenville, South Carolina called Furman, eventually getting his PhD at Chicago, ended up at Johns Hopkins, taking over the lab that was vacated, I believe, by G. Stanley Hall, who went to be president of Clark University. Look at that. He says, introspective psychology is no longer serviceable. What happened is he proposed that the ideas of the founders of psychology were not accepted in order to make a true science. And as a consequence, as we write in our book on the brief history of psychology, Michael Wertheimer and I talk about that psychology's goal has been to pursue a respected position in the world of STEM, in the world of science. And I think there's been some confusion between the methodology of behaviorism and the theory of behaviorism. So as a consequence, we have had some kind of revisionistic history has been written. For example, simple as it seems, look at just about any intro book and you'll see that the basic definition that people use to define psychology is B.F. Skinner, which I think happens to be a wonderful one. However, as Michael has suggested, we have not had a system, a cohesive system like psychoanalysis, like behaviorism in the last 50 years. And this is producing a lack of sustainability for our discipline. Keep this as a second kind of thought. The first one is who I am. The second one is this thing about who we've been. So now let's shift our focus to the Browning of America and psychology's challenge, or in my words, a problem. All right. How popular is psychology? Insanely popular. I was in the original AP committee back in 1990-91 with Wilbur McKeechee. When we put that together, we tested the first year 4,000 students. This year, look at that, 300,000. Do you know how many students take intro to psychology every year in the US? 1 million students. And it happens to be probably one of the biggest majors in just about every university. Ours is a big, how big is it here? 2,000. We're number 2. So it's not atypical for psychology to be really, really powerful. And if you're wondering, is it elsewhere? There are almost as many psychologists in the Republic of Colombia as there are in the United States of America. Psychology is insanely popular, both in the US and the rest of the world. And even APA, we're now to about 125,000, and there's no signs of slowing down. So psychology is vibrant, but it turns out maybe it's not matching, as I'll share with you, with who's out there. Hispanics are the biggest ethnic minority group. As a matter of fact, just to give you to the last punchline, it looks like at this particular juncture that by the year 2050, 2060, Hispanics may be the majority group in the United States. And here's the more specifics of it all. Notice that Hispanics represent roughly 19% of the population, and whites represent about 59% of the population. And the growth is, as you see, astronomical, largely because the typical Hispanic family has more children than the typical Caucasian or African American or Black family in the US. And in case you haven't figured it out, there are 18 other countries. The rest of the Americas all speak Spanish, minus, of course, Brazil and a couple of the adjoining countries. Now, how does APA fit into all this? 85% of APA is white. There are about 6,000 or 7,000 psychologists who are considering themselves to be Hispanic. And interestingly, the majority of them happen to be in counseling and happen to be not in non-academic settings. And using neuropsychology as an example, there are probably 100 individuals that speak Spanish and do clinical neuropsychology. In my world, you have to go as far north as Washington, D.C., or as far south as, to be almost exact, Atlanta to find another Spanish-speaking neuropsychologist. Somehow or the other, what APA looks like does not reflect what our demographics look like. So let's go to a deeper dive. I just got this earlier today, and you can't see it in great detail, but let me just share with you two interesting things. First of all, there are roughly the same number of males as females in psychology. Males tend to be older, females tend to be younger, males tend to be in academic, females tend to be in the practice world, and the younger cohort tend to be female. But it turns out, look at this last on the far right, race and ethnicity, 85%. Is that what the number is? Yeah, 85%, 84.4 are white. So what's happening in APA is we are not keeping up with the demographic shifts. Well, hold on a second. What about U of F? All right. Thank you, Julia. So for sharing this, I've adapted just a little bit. And here's what I did for you, Julia. I looked at the numbers in comparison, and when they were not good, I put them in red. When they were good, I put them in green. All right. So way too many whites relative to the population at large. Way too many. As far as Latinx or Hispanics, a higher representation. So not so good in your Caucasian numbers, really good in your Latin numbers. As far as Black or African American, Asian, holding its own. All right, what about psych graduate students? Here we have good numbers for Black, Asian, and Latin group. For the white, you know, typical of what you see in the national level, but not typical of what should be seen at the national level. And what about the faculty? Here are the faculty. Well, a lot of white people, especially a lot of white males, some Latin, but as you can see, they're mostly pre-tenure, so are the Asians. And finally, you have a good cohort of international. So it seems a little bit more of a mixed review. So let's go through it real quickly. So you see a large number of Hispanics for undergraduates, fairly equal distribution in terms of the standard ethnic minority groups for graduate students, and then a mixed bag when it comes to psych professors. This is not a condemnation for this program. Actually, we have in my department no Black or African Americans. We only have 2 Hispanics, and both of us are foreign born. And we have 1 Asian. So in essence, basically, this is a typical reflection of the rest of psychology. They're not matching. So here's the chapter 3 from the Standards of Educational and psychological test that we put out in 2014. Every about 30 years, this book, which is one of the two standards. There's two standards in psychology. One are the ethical standards, and this is the other one on test and measurement. This is from the chapter 3, which I helped write. And that is, let me read it for those of us who may not have the opportunity to see this. A test, or if you will, evaluation that is fair does not unduly advantage or disadvantage certain examinees because of an individual characteristics that are irrelevant to the construct being measured. So here's the question. What is the construct? What is the construct? In the American Psychological Foundation, of which I'm on the board, one of the things we're finding is that we're giving almost no scholarships to students of historically Black colleges or Haku type schools. So essentially, if you are ethnic minority, the chances are much lower that you get one of these scholarships. They're going to typically white students from really privileged and highly ranked schools. Is that our goal? Are we going to have tests like the SATs or like the GREs? Or if you go to a good school, are you going to get into a good program? What are we going to do? Some of us say no, we have to have the standards high. I think people like Shockley and others said that as well. All right, so now I'm going to pose some questions as we get to the really deep analysis. Neuropsychology or psychology and power. I'm going to read you these questions and I want you to think about it. Are we measuring or interpreting scientific constructs in what we do as psychological science? Because most psychological science is being done by white males. Are we doing scientific constructs or are we measuring or interpreting cultural constructs? Hans Eyck once said that the best measure of intelligence was reaction time. If you're Latin, reaction time is not something you do quickly, it's something that you enjoy. So somebody asks you a question, you want to go, yeah, let's talk about it. In the US, you're retarded. Okay? It's got to be quick or it's not good. What? No. All right. 2, are interpretations of psychological knowledge nothing more than power constructs? The beginning of psychology was basically circumscribed to 32 people that came from Ivy League schools, all males. It took 20 some years for an ethnic minority to be board certified in clinical neuropsychology. It took 125 years for APA to elect a president who spoke Spanish. 125 years. Are these power constructs developed by a cross sample of the population we seek to understand and serve? Do we look at the population and ask, does psychology reflect that population? No. We got to look at your GPA. We got to look at your SAT. We got to look at the number of pubs. We got to, a few presentations will help. Do you come from a good school? Yes, we'll look at you. Otherwise, not so much. And as far as like those people that are different than us, don't worry, they respond to client-centered psychotherapy, which was developed by Carl Rogers, overlooking the cliffs of the Pacific Ocean in La Jolla, California, where people like me went during the day to do the yards of people that he treated. Or are these ideas developed by those who are interested in developing and keeping the intellectual and societal status quo? As not being from Florida, I can say, I cannot believe that the governor has gotten into the business of public education. This is unbelievable. The fact that some of us are worried about getting tenure or speaking in our classrooms because of limitations of what is it that you should consider is all about keeping a certain power differential. And that power differential has nothing to do with the truth. So here's the question for you. Is this knowledge that we have nothing more than intellectual and scientific imperialism? Do we want to keep the ideas of people who run the show so I can continue running the show? My son, who worked for Barack Obama, said, Papa, one of the things that you do when you're in Congress is make sure you get elected. That's the primary job. So are we developing another phrenology? Just like when I went to Nairobi a few years ago and I said, I want to do something here in the psych department. So psychology doesn't apply to us. We don't believe in quantitative approaches to understanding behavior in the mind. So are we developing a science that's going to be only fruitful for people of privilege and people of power? So here's what I think might be the future of who psychology might look like. First of all, we got to return to our roots. Let's go back to the beginning, just like I told you about those books. Those books talk about brain and behavior and about consciousness and about purpose. We may have strayed away from that. And maybe most importantly, we need to address the issue of culture. We are just in many ways starting to add culture to what psychology is. We added the idea of diversity to APA as an add-on. What I'm proposing is it has to be considered a core. We just finished the Minnesota conference in Minneapolis this last Friday, and we were talking about cultural neuropsychology, and I propose that we drop the word cultural in cultural neuropsychology, that neuropsychology is all cultural. Psychology is all cultural, and power constructs define what is important and how those constructs are defined. So specifically, the idea is that, and this, by the way, is really not me as much as it is Luria, that psychology is nothing more than understanding of culture, which cannot be achieved using a strict paradigm that's limited to a European or American approach. Because what will happen is we'll discover, as I have, that people of Latin origin score 15 points lower than their Caucasian counterparts. And for that matter, if you're African American or Black, don't feel bad, you're in the same boat. So that must mean that we must be intellectually deficient. And by the way, Asians score a little bit higher than their counterparts. So for them, we have a different interpretation. For brown and Black people, yes, you're probably genetically inferior, as has been written in psychology. And for Asians who are surprisingly good on standardized tests, well, you had good tiger moms. Huh? So in essence, that paradigm is not sustainable for a global psychology. So here's an idea. Should we value the concepts, the psychometric, the scientific, the quantitative concepts of people like Sperry and add the qualitative concepts of people like Luria? So he proposed the idea of qualitative analysis was entirely what he considered romantic science. And that is study the person inside of a social historical context. That if you do not do that, it doesn't make sense. In the book that I did, one of his students, Neuropsychology of the Spanish Speaker, in 1994, we discovered that if you have brain injury and at least 6 years of education, you look on neuropsychological tests like people that don't have brain injury and no education. Now, they may be, quote, intellectually deficient, but they're getting along really nicely in places like the Amazon. Somehow or the other, they figured it out. So the idea is to integrate both. Consider this idea. Maybe what you should do is consider and appreciate the psychometric Western properties of the empirical psychology. After all, Sperry was the first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize. And then take the romantic science of Luria, which he obtained from his mentor, Vygotsky, a historian, from a social historical perspective. and then have a hybrid approach. And this next comment is really more for neuropsychologists, that you look at the brain from the right to left and if you will, from bottom to top. But let me propose this. Let's take the very empirical Western psychology and add to it the ecological model of multicultural guidelines, which is published by APA, and you should be aware of those a couple of years ago. So take the empirical with the qualitative and add them together. If you do that, then you might have at least a psychology that will be coverage of all of the Americas, that allows for both quantitative and qualitative. And if you don't, here's what might happen. You might end up where I came from. And specifically, you might end up in Kohimar, which is next, it's a port next to that beautiful beach. And this is where the old man, a guy named Santiago, would wake up every morning, row out to the Gulf Stream, which is about 5 miles, and try to catch a big fish. And if you haven't read this book, you really should. Old Man in the Sea, won a Nobel Prize himself for literature. It's a short read, fascinating read, but it's about the struggle of one guy trying to find the truth with one fish. And some days, like recently, I was told that I probably could get a PhD student in my lab that was ethnic minority, probably in a decade. And I see you sitting there going, am I still having to beg to be able to train people to make sure that who we are in psychology reflects who we are as a nation, and for that matter, as a world? Do we want to make psychology a viable discipline, or we will age and find ourselves saying, wow, that was the phrenology of the 20th century? Because phrenology was extremely popular in the 19th century. Let's make sure that we realize that we're here not to allow certain ideas, certain kinds of thoughts, certain kinds of people to rule. That the truth involves transparency, inclusiveness, and a willingness to accept other views that are not our own. Otherwise, the future of psychology will be limited to only the privileged, the white, and the industrialized. And that is not why we're here. So today I come here with the idea of think about psychology, think about diversity, ethnic, inclusion, equity as really not something that we should do. We should have an extra course, an extra student, an extra faculty member, but as who we are as people. If not, we have no future. And I don't know about you, I'm tired of fishing by myself in the Gulf Stream. Let's come together and make sure that there's a future for you and the future society. Psychology is needed more than ever by the world. Let's make it happen. Let's make it sustainable. Thank you for your time and your opportunity to be with you this afternoon. And thank you all for being with us on the Zoom. I appreciate the opportunity. And now I know it's about 1 hour into this, so I don't really know what our situation is. All right. Well, let's do this, Julie, if you don't mind. Some of the folks we have quite a few folks on Zoom. Why don't we just see whether we can take 1 or 2 comments or so from Zoom, and then we'll turn it over to our live audience as well. I know some of us have to go. After all, this is intended to be a 1 hour event, but some of us are still here. Like I think Dr. Devine, who looks very, very serious. maybe he might be interested. He might be interested in asking the first question or providing a comment. So let's give one of them the first dibs at this, and then we'll come back to the audience. Let's do both Zoom and the live audience. All right, Adrian. Adrian needs to lower his hand because right before my talk at 4 o'clock, he asked to join me on LinkedIn. I said, Adrian, give me a chance to give my talk before you decide whether you want to be part of LinkedIn.
Thank you for the opportunity. So I just have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, talking about knowing where we're coming from, the history of the field, and, in terms of power, right? I'm wondering, given your experience, given being the leader, the president of APA for a year, how do we talk about power, and not just empowering communities, but recognizing that there is advantages to certain groups keeping that power, right, around how we view others or how we assess. So how as a field can we be honest about how we wield that power to sometimes hurt people as well as advantage ourselves? So I wanted, I guess, to get your perspective on how can we be honest and truthful about how we use that power to help and to hurt?
Well, I think first of all, we have to acknowledge it. I think APA's apology that came out last year with Jennifer Kelly is a first step in this process. Of course, the real question is not like, okay, it's easy to apologize. It's not so easy to make that apology actually have teeth, have action, and that's what APA is now grappling. I think what we need to do is, it's not like if you're a white male, you're a bad person, and if you happen to be, say, Black and trans, you're good. I think that's ridiculous. I think we need to have a sense of understanding that all are equal, all have to give opportunity to move forward. And the question is, how do you do that? Now, I will tell you personally, how I did it is I feel like I had to work a hell of a lot harder than my counterparts for people to listen to me. And I'm not kidding when I use that first comment, as a subtitle. This talk you can't do as a non-tenure faculty member. And honestly, you can't do this talk until you have a crap load of publications in multiple languages. You can't do this because otherwise you will get washed out of the system fast. So somebody said, the other day I was in Minnesota and I gave a tiny variation of this talk there. And somebody said, I can't believe you gave this talk. I've never seen you be so assertive about these issues. It's like, well, last talk you heard me was right before I was APA president. It's a different story when you have a sense of that you're not going to get shipped home. Actually, I moderated a hearing in Congress several years ago, right before COVID, about immigration. And it's the first time I came out publicly saying that I was undocumented for 10 years. I said, look, this is a good time to get arrested. Bring it on, and of course, people don't do that, but you can't do that if you don't have papers. You can't do that if you don't have power. You can't do that if you don't have a sense of comfort about who you are. And you may have a difficult time being a faculty member at University of Florida, Department of Psychology, under the current situation that we have in your state. And I apologize on behalf of all psychology. It's a tough situation. How about a comment or question from the audience? I certainly wouldn't mind if it was a student. Yes. Hi. Sure. Right. So, right. So the question is, how do you turn this into action? And the suggestion that you gave is, let's make sure that race is one of the critical factors, just like we think of age and, for that matter, gender as a variable of significance. Well, let me tell you, we are doing that, and we are encouraging people not so much to do that, but to address the issue of socioeconomic status, which may be a more significant variable than things like race. Okay. And I think that's much more complicated. Like I just told you earlier, the education alone, not having education alone, makes you look like you're brain impaired. Okay, and these people are living well in in the Amazon, so obviously there are no problems. From our vantage point, there is. Now, let me tell you about two specific things that I've done that are important to me, and I think could be important to psychology. First of all, for those of you who know something about my background, my biggest claim to fame is the development of what we call current procedural terminology codes for the reimbursement of psychological services. When I got involved in all this back in 1980s, there were only like 2 or 3 codes, like basically psychotherapy and testing and interview. I became APA's first representative to the AMA on this particular topic, and we expanded to about 60, and eventually I became part of the panel to decide how these codes are done. So the idea was, let's figure out a way for psychology in general to be reimbursed appropriately so that it can have a sustainable practice, so to speak. And doing that, then you would have to have sustainable science to support that practice. So sometimes you have to just go do it yourself. And the final one, when I was president of APA, I found myself with a very, very, very tough situation. We had the Hoffman report, which required a lot of ethics questions about who we were as an association. 75% of the executive management group were either fired, disappeared, whatever. So we were without a CEO and most of the management. So we tried to rebuild APA, and we set everything on the table. And it was about that time that I got elected. So did my good friend, Donald Trump. And I say good friend because I ended up working in the White House on a task force with him. And I can tell you that I still don't know how he does his hair. But that was a real important thing for me to find out. But I did find out that it was a very negative view of psychology. So we broke up APA into 2, and we now have a C3 and we have a C6. The C6 is total political advocacy that is funded by 60% of the dues to APA. So we focus on things like immigration. We're now involved in issues of gender rights, reproductive rights, obviously reimbursement, all those things. So we're very, very focused on having a strong presence on the Hill, in Congress, and for that matter, in the White House. So, I think some of us think that the world revolves around campuses like University of Florida, which is beautiful, but the world does not view us in the same way we do. Let's go to the world. George Miller said back in 1962, we have to give psychology away. We have to do a better job. Let's take one more comment or question from the Zoom audience. Dr. Devine, is that? Yes, okay.
Yes, thank you. So it seems to me that as you were coming up through the system, there were a number of occasions in which you were actively kind of dismissed. But we are a faculty group that, as you pointed out, is largely white and male, and we make efforts to recruit ethnic minorities into our fold. I think we have a problem with retention, where somebody comes in and they're from a different group, and do you have any suggestions for retention strategies for building our department?
Well, I just sent Julia an email from the National Latino Psychological Association about your hire. Go ahead, Julia. Yeah. Well, I think that's the way you do it. You make him part of a bigger role.
Yeah, I mean, we're launching our sponsor hires to try to bring in diversity focused around the cluster and to see how that goes. I mean, I think our worries, are kind of getting at, what Dr. Devine is also saying is that how are we going to do with recruitment given the broader climate? And then are people going to feel more challenges and oppression as they try to transition into the early career here in the program?
Well, one thing you can do also, Dr. Devine, is mentor these people especially to make sure that like when I got into all this, every committee that involved an ethnic minority you were on, well, which is great, but then you can't publish, So we have to be careful not to squeeze these people in the wrong way. And for people that have been successful, like yourself and other members, you have a great group of faculty. Make sure that you mentor them to make sure that they are more than ethnic minorities. I dream for the day that Black people could do cognitive research that had nothing to do with ethnicity. It'd just be so lovely just for anybody could do anything. It doesn't mean like I should do cultural neuropsychology. I should do strokes, but in some ways I can't. Provide the climate, the support, the mentor. And then now that I'm on your advisory board, call me. Say, take out these people to lunch, Tony. Take them dancing. I don't know, whatever. Make sure that they stay, And the problem that I see, Dr. Devine, is I wish it was you. I wish it was your department that was problematic. It turns out there's an outflux occurring right now of ethnic minorities in academia in general. Like my son works at Slack/Salesforce, a good PhD, quantitative psychologist, he's willing to hire for $200,000, $250,000 to live in beautiful San Francisco. Like, well, why would I want to go hassle trying to get tenure? When I can go make $1 zillion and have a great lifestyle. So, but as you guys know, because you've been here a long time, like I have, there's some beautiful things that come with being an academic and being a university setting. We need to sell that on folks to make sure that there's a future for them, but more than that, there's a future for psychology. Otherwise, we're just not gonna, I worry about the days that only really bright white people end up in psychology. That's just not good. We didn't get a single Black student in our clinical cohort this time. And they would just say, we just didn't have a good Black candidate. Or, like Nellie Burry, who's now a professor at the University of Miami School of Medicine, she got a 700 on her GREs. And I said, I'm going to take this person. She was Black, she's Dominican, she was living in Puerto Rico, and she had 2 publications and 6 presentations. The proof is in the pudding. The construct was not the GRE. This construct was this person could actually do research. I begged the admissions committee, please, let's ignore her GREs. Let's give her a try. Maybe that's what we need to do. Hold people up to the highest standards possible, but give everybody an opportunity. We can't have the psychology we have for a long time. It's just not gonna be there. How about a couple of comments? I think that's a good step. APA debated the issue of whether we should encourage people not to make GREs number 1. And it was a really difficult debate, believe it or not.
That's actually one of the places where maybe non-applied disciplines within psychology, I think for clinical programs in particular, it's just extremely, and it's convenient. What do you do with 600 applicants to a program if you can't use a quick screener? But when you come down at the end of the day to something that predicts gender and race ethnicity, and that's all it predicts, it doesn't predict performance, it doesn't predict time to degree completion, it doesn't predict anything that you care about in the success of graduate students, just gender and race ethnicity. which most people will tell you on the floor, without paying a fee to ECS. So I don't understand the arguments that we do.
When how fast you can do. When I took the GRE, I remember getting, in those days you had to wait, so forth. I remember opening it up with my brother in the backyard, and I was like, bro, this is my future. Oh my God, I'm so nervous. I opened it up and I said, bro, I have no future. So I crumpled it up, threw in the trash can. It's like, no, it ain't gonna work. So what's the construct? What for me, you know, if you can do research, I'm good to go. Okay. So can I ask Dr. Chandler, who looks very serious, what's your takeaway from this? And then I'll ask one of the young students in the audience, this lady with, yeah, you're the one that took the sip. We'll ask you. So Dr. Chandler is getting a little late. How about if we get you to, what's your takeaway from this conversation? And then we'll ask the student in the back for her takeaway as well, and we'll call it a day. Dr. Chandler, what do you think about all of this?
Dr. Puente, thank you so much for being here and for educating us and enlightening us as well. I was actually made a note here to send you an email afterward, but I'll share it with you with the audience. But several things came to mind about what you were talking about. How do we actually, ignore some of the testing that is clearly biased, that biases people of color, low SES, and so forth, GRE being an example. And I thought about multiple intelligence and Schreiber theory of intelligence, some way that we look at the overall capability of an individual as a candidate, as opposed to whatever the typical standardized test might be. There's some way to truly look at that person and know who they are, irrespective of race, color, creed, and socioeconomic status. And I don't have any idea exactly how to implement something like that as a tool to bring more people in that truly are capable. You know, and you said they can not only do the research, but they can write, they can communicate, they can think in ways that we can't think. So that's what came to my mind about this, is with this completely outside of the path that we take, and as far as evaluating someone to join our program.
I'll give you an answer to that in a roundabout way. In my world as a neuropsychologist, when I started, most of my evaluation was psychometric, and the history was small. Now that I've gotten more into it, and for example, I do death penalty work, which I might study someone for years. So my evaluations are now like 100 pages, and to require going to their homes, studying them, talking to them, and doing some testing. Testing is important and necessary, especially to anchor it. But in reality, it's a social cultural part that has, in my world, become much, much more important. Which of course is, as I used to ask Barry, I said, Roger, it's all this qualitative stuff that it's so important. You know, we have the quantitative stuff pretty much down. As a matter of fact, one afternoon I was talking to him and I said, Roger, do you think that the hardwired, easily quantified stuff is by far the most important in the nature nurture question? He goes, yeah. How much? And he goes, I don't know. I said 95%. He goes, yeah. And just like that, I whipped out this bizarre question. Is the 5% remaining more important? He goes, yeah. So how do we measure that? How do we get that in a tangible way that allows us to screen a whole bunch of potential faculty members or a bunch of potential students? Difficult. Will statistics eventually teach us more than analysis of variance and t-tests and structured equation modeling? Do we have to live in a world where it's all about hypothesis testing? My son lives my non-neuropsychology son lives in a world of big data. He says, I have no hypothesis, data talk to me. My neuropsychology says I ask the question, the data tell me the answer. You know, who's right? All right. I'm sorry to say you get the last word. So please tell us at least your first name. Kat. Yeah, let's have a Black faculty member. If we got one, we're good. I will tell you that APA, which I'm very familiar with, I'm still highly involved. They do a great job of talking the talk, but they do a horrible job of walking the walk. And I think that reflects all of psychology. The future psychology requires to talk the talk, walk the walk, and then forget that we're even thinking about that. Can we all dream for a sustainable, robust, and inclusive and equitable psychology? If we don't, we have no future. I look forward to keeping up with you, keeping up with the future of psychology, making sure that we get to where we need to go. The world needs us bad. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to share with you some other questions if you want to stay a few more minutes. But for those of you who've been with us in Zoom, including my students, thank you. And all of you today, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Puente.
All right. Thank you all.
Are you shutting off the Zoom?
All right. See ya.